Welcome. This briefing concerns the ways of being human which characterized the Hellenic civilization which developed along the northeast coast of the Mediterranean basin during the Bronze Age, between 3000 and 1000 before the Common Era, and which underwent profound transformations during the Iron Age, after 1000 before the Common Era, being one example of what we have called the Axial Age transformations, leading to the development of the mystery religions which would later provide the formal matrix for the development of Christianity, the whole dramatic tradition, and the practice which eventually became known as philosophy. The Mediterranean provided a unique ecosystem, the hot, dry summers and wet, cool to mild winters, with long, mild springs, while not especially hospitable for grain cultivation, which was often limited to barley, especially in Greece proper, were ideal for cultivating olives for oil and grapes for wine. The relatively dry terrain was also suitable as pasture, especially for sheep. This meant that the whole region was predisposed from the beginning to trade. Neolithic settlements were found in Greece as early as 6000 before the Common Era, following the old European pattern. These were likely communal villages cultivating grain, wine, and oil, and as Indo-Europeans filtered into the area after 5000 before the Common Era, raising sheep, goats, and cattle as well. Settlements indicate permanent dwellings, complex pottery, and stone tools, but no palaces or religious monumentalization. The dominant religious images are of pregnant women and bulls, as was common throughout Old Europe, supplemented by labyrinths. What do you think the labyrinth might mean as a religious symbol? We will see that the motif appears in many different cultures. Have you ever walked a labyrinth? There's one up at Richland College if you want to visit it. Beginning around 3200 before the Common Era, bronze technology began to appear in the region. As elsewhere, this led to the conquest of villages by warlords who built palace-centered cities. In Greece, these warlords were little more than cattle raiders, and the settlements they built were governed by a wanax, or king, assisted by a laugetes, or leader of the people. These were priestly military rulers leading an aristocracy of equates or telestai, equals or initiates. This aristocracy extracted rents, taxes, and forced labor from dependent peasant communities, and used it to build palaces and support raiding expeditions on their neighbors. The polytheistic religion retained its agrarian and pastoral focus, but there was more emphasis on sacrifice and conquest. This civilizational pattern culminated in the Mycenaean civilization between 1650 and 1060 before the Common Era that we see depicted in the Iliad and the Odyssey, though the current form of these epics dates from much later. Around 1060 before the Common Era, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, part of the pattern that we've called the crisis of the Late Bronze Age. Urban civilization and writing all but disappeared from Greece until around 800 before the Common Era, resulting in a period known as the Dark Ages, and when it reappeared, it did so on a very different basis. First, we see the full development of the specialized agriculture, the potential for which was latent in the Mediterranean ecosystem from the very beginning. Rather than growing food for their own subsistence and trading a bit on the side, Hellenic cities began producing primarily for trade. This system, in which all goods and services are for sale, we call petty commodity production. This in turn led to rapid economic differentiation. Those with access to good land and to markets got rich. Others, including some of the old ruling classes, lost out and became poor. Debt servitude was widespread. This in turn led to a series of peasant revolts, which resulted in a variety of settlements, from the Spartan approach, which involved enslaving all of the surrounding peoples in order to liberate their own peasants as full-time hoplites or light-armored infantry, to the Athenian settlement, which involved using chattel slaves taken in raiding expeditions to carry out partial land reform and allow their richer peasants to serve as hoplites. With much of the peasantry now armed, sanctuary-based sappho monarchies gave way to democracies and tyrannies as vigorous class struggle ensued. This is the context in which the axial transformation took place in Greece. It involved three elements. First, old meanings which had been taken for granted were called into question. This is what we have called religious problematization. Old stories, for example, were retold with new meanings, most prominently through the drama festival which accompanied the annual feast of Dionysius during the grape harvest. Petty commodity production created a new world in which everything had a number, a price, which in turn was the basis for the emergence of a new layer of abstract thought, characterized by abstract mathematics, and for rethinking the divine in a more abstract way as the one or the infinite. We call this religious rationalization. And the class struggle was not only about land or political rights, it was also about access to full cultic participation. In the old days, the ruling families were considered to be the descendants of the gods, and thus to have the possibility of some kind of immortality, or theosis, deification. Now, new mystery cults, such as the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphic mysteries, emerged, which promised ordinary people the wisdom which would allow them to become divine. These cults all shared a common pattern. An individual seeking membership would undergo catechesis or teaching. They would then pass through an initiation ritual, such as being dragged down into a cave so that they passed out, or dipped in water, symbolizing a new birth. Finally, the mystery was revealed to them, and they enjoyed a communion feast. The similarities with Christianity are not accidental. When the story of Jesus was appropriated in the Hellenistic cities of the Eastern Mediterranean hundreds of years later, it was grafted onto the form of the mystery cults, which already included dying and rising gods. From there, the process of religious rationalization continued. Gods who in the epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, appeared as characters with personalities, became, in Hesiod's theogony, personified natural forces such as chaos, Uranos or heaven, Gaia or earth, and Chronos or time. Eventually, natural philosophers such as Thales of Miletus and Heraclitus began to explore the universe as the product of natural forces alone, such as water or fire, or as the product of number itself, a path taken by Pythagoras. When they did speak of God, they used terms like the infinite and the one. The Greek polis was, however, the site of some intense contradictions. As its economic model was replicated, the older city-states lost their comparative advantage. By the middle of the 4th century, incomes were falling. While in at least some cities, such as Athens, all free males could vote, they were manipulated and controlled by rhetors paid by the wealthy to promote policies which served their interests. These rhetors in turn created a school of philosophy known as Sophism, which taught that there is no such thing as the good, the true, and the beautiful. Instead, they claimed these are just social conventions, or even worse, just the expression of the will of the stronger. Socrates and Plato believed that this doctrine was destroying the polis and set out to reground a discourse around justice. Socrates concentrated on demonstrating that the sophistic position was internally contradictory. He showed, for example, that we really can't claim that justice is just the will of the stronger, because the stronger can be wrong, and that means that they would be working against their own self-interest. Plato went further. He makes his point through a story in which prisoners are trapped in a cave. They're chained to their seats and watch images on a cave wall, which they believe are real. One of these prisoners escapes and discovers that they are actually shadows cast by puppets, manipulated by puppeteers on the ledge above them. Then he goes further, escaping from the cave altogether, and discovers the real world of which the images and puppets in the cave are just imitations, as well as the sun, which makes all of the real things, of which everything happening in the cave is an image, or an image of an image, or an image of an image of an image, possible. What do you think Plato is trying to say in this allegory, and what do you think about it? There are, Plato suggests, 4 different levels of knowledge, which he maps out using the image of a divided line. At the lowest level is imagination. Think here just of our ability to form and retain images, not imaginative creativity. Plato believes that this is the lowest degree of knowledge because images can become distorted. Think of a reflection in a funhouse mirror or a distorted stereotype. The second level he calls faith or trust, by which he means trusting our senses. This is more accurate than imagination, but it is still very limited. Look at a chair. Can you recognize it as a chair? Of course. But try to define a chair rigorously. That is much harder. In order to get there, we need to rigorously describe the structure of the chair the way one would in a blueprint or a set of geometric forms. This would allow us to make a chair. This higher level of knowledge, the third from the bottom, Plato calls thought, by which he really means mathematical formalization. And ultimately, we need to know what the chair is for, its purpose, which alone will allow us to design a better chair. This is the highest level of knowledge, which Plato calls dialectics. Of course, Plato was not concerned primarily with defining chairs. He was trying to show that as we move to higher levels of knowledge, we can arrive at a principle, which he calls the good, on the basis of which the universe can be explained and human action ordered. Everything seeks the good to the extent of its ability. Aristotle systematized this argument, arguing that the phenomenal world was characterized by motion, by which he really meant change of any kind. Everything that moves, he said, must have a mover. But there cannot be an infinite regress or chain of movers going backwards forever, because then there would be no first mover and no motion at all. So there must be a first mover which is itself unmoved, and which moves everything else by its sheer goodness, beauty, and truth, which everything in the universe finds attractive. This is, in effect, the first argument for the existence of God. The argument can be restated more powerfully using causation rather than motion. Things exist. Everything that exists must have a cause. There can be no infinite regress of causes, or else there would be no first cause, and thus nothing would exist. So there must be a first cause that has the power of being in itself. Aristotle taught that everything in the universe seeks to become as much like the unmoved mover as it can. Another way of saying this is that everything seeks being. Minerals seek to retain their form, becoming crystals. Plants engage in nutrition, growth, and reproduction, persisting in being. Animals engage in sensation and locomotion, taking on the forms of other things and being in more than one place. Human beings have reason and will. We can understand how things are organized and what they are for, and bring new and more complex forms of being into existence. In the process, we grow in intellectual and moral virtue, and create complex societies which support this intellectual and moral development. You may be wondering how these philosophical doctrines are related to religion. That's a good question. First, the doctrines put forward by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle answer the fundamental questions which all religion asks. What does it mean? What does it mean to be human? And how do we realize our final end or purpose? Second, people actually live these doctrines, usually in conjunction with one or more of the more intellectually oriented mystery cults, such as the Eleusinian mysteries. And finally, Plato and Aristotle had a profound influence on the later development of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thought, something we will look at later in the course. For now, though, just think about what it means to live seeking being.